Democratic State Representative Nicole Collier of Fort Worth, thank you so much for joining us. Certainly the end of the legislative session made national headlines. How would you characterize it?
Well, it's the end for now. Thanks, Jack, for having me. I appreciate it. The session was filled with a lot of wins for the conservative majority in the legislature. There wasn't much that we can go home with as Democrats. We were able to get Medicaid uh, guaranteed for those who are just having their children. We extended the time that they would have it from 3 to 6 months, and then there's more children who will be eligible for the Medicaid. So, that's a win for us. But another win would be broadband access. Extending that to those urban and rural areas where where there are low opportunities. There's not many opportunities for broadband access. But the Republican-led legislature, they came out with so many wins. When they're talking about limiting the educators' flexibility to teach our children, dictating how race is going to be discussed in our schools. The bills with critical race theory just basically whitewash history by providing the narrative that they want the children to know. Then we saw permitless carry that passed the legislature. We had one point, and I'm sorry, I'm just going into this because there's just so much to discuss and unpack what happened at the legislature. But one of our colleagues, a Democratic colleague for permitless carry, had a amendment on the bill that would preclude pretext stops for officers. We know that African Americans are more likely to be stopped than their white counterparts by police. And all the amendment did was say that you cannot use the fact that somebody is permitlessly carrying or open carrying because of the color of their skin. And they stripped that out. That was a common sense measure that they weren't willing to accept. So, that is just an example, a small example of what we've seen coming out of this last session.
And so let me ask you, just going back to Senate Bill 7, because again, that made certainly a lot of the headlines. I know before this decision was made, I watched as you were trying to ask Representative Kane just more about this conference committee report, which did have some new provisions in it, and they didn't allow that. And so talk to me about the decision that was made for you to walk out. Had this come up before? Because I know the Democratic caucus had met with Speaker Phelan about this late in the afternoon, hours before this all went on.
Well, we always want to make sure that we keep our options open. And so, of course, that is an option that was always on the table. But, SB 7, the process of SB 7 getting to the floor from the committee is no different from how this whole session has transpired. I mean, it got to the point where Democrats were negotiating the amount of time our members could speak against measures as opposed to negotiating what was in them. And so we realize and we know that they were actually more tolerating us as opposed to respecting us. And so and when it got to that point, we knew that we had to take that drastic step and walk off the floor.
And so, as you said, as you pointed out, there is going to be a special session. There will be a special session on this issue, according to the governor. And so how will you try to, prevent this legislation, or at least make some changes to the legislation?
Well, we hope it doesn't end up the same way it's been all this session. We are expecting this bill to get worse. Whenever the governor calls the special session, he's going to set the agenda, and we anticipate and probably expect him to add this measure back. And I expect that this would get worse. So, what was already in the bill was bad. But what they could add is more show me your papers and cameras in the polling location for these poll watchers. SB 7 was bad because they emboldened poll watchers to harass people. they had free range. They will have free range under that bill. They would have had free range across anywhere where the election activities was happening. And so, these are harassing techniques used by untrained poll watchers. And there was nothing in that bill that would have required poll watchers to be trained, but rather criminalize small mistakes from election officials.
And let me ask you about that, because I think at some point this was brought up, maybe before the conference committee report, maybe in a prior version when it was going through the House. And Representative Kane said that the poll watchers were not there to harass voters. They were there to keep an eye on the elections workers. And what's your thought about that? Did that change from that initial bill?
Look, that's what they say, but is that what they're gonna do? I mean, what has happened? What happened in Texas that would require these types of provisions? They won. I don't know why they're trying to preemptively cut out people's access to the ballot box. They are intending to have measures that would definitely limit access to voting for people of color. And so, why they need this, I don't know why they feel the need, other than to push their conservative agenda to silence the voice of Black and Brown people.
And you're referring to the new provision that was added, the souls to the polls, which would only allow early voting on a Sunday to start at 1 o'clock. Is that right?
Yes, yeah, my community definitely takes advantage of this. There's so many churches that once church is over, they take they all go as a collective effort to the polls. No one's telling them how to vote, but it actually helps people get out to the polls. And so by adding that 1 hour, by saying that you can't vote before 1 p.m., is really going to drop those opportunities. It's going to decrease the opportunity to have that momentum behind them to get to the polls. And that's what they want. They want to shut us down. They want to, whatever they can do to knock us down. That's what they're trying to do. And that's why we got to take a stand and do what we can to fight off these harmful provisions.
And let me ask you, because yesterday we saw Governor Abbott tweet basically suggesting, some would say threatening, to veto the legislative budget based on those who walked out. So for you, you wouldn't get paid for that day, presumably. I don't know what the details will end up being. What was your reaction to that?
Okay, legislators get paid in the Texas House. We get paid $600 a month. Most of us have other jobs that we work in addition to our service in the legislature. So this threat that he's made, which I don't know how he's going to do it, would cut not only the budget of all legislators, Republicans and Democrats, but our staff as well, and those who work in the House of Representatives. Because our budget is not a line item budget, it's just straight up. It gives the House the discretion on how to allocate the dollars. And so for him to say that he's going to veto Article 10, which is where the House of Representatives budget is lodged, is I'm just not sure how he's going to be able to do that without cutting everyone's pay, and that's going to impact the salaries of the families, the people's families that work here.
What about, I was talking to State Senator Royce West, whose first impression was, what about separation of powers? Uh, is that a factor here?
Well, definitely. I mean, now he's saying that he's going to dictate the budget of the legislative branch. He's the executive branch. There is an separation of powers, and so he's going to usurp the power, which he's been doing anyway. So we shouldn't be surprised. But he's suggesting that he's going to continue to usurp the power of the legislative branch of government and insert his own decision unilaterally of what how the budget can be handled. So I like to see his ideas. I mean, literally, it's childish.
And let me ask you about bail reform, because that did not pass in the final House Bill 20. Where were you on that issue? And clearly the governor has said that's going to come back in a special session.
Well, let me tell you this. If anybody was watching on that day, there were measures that were brought up out of order. So there were measures that were on the clock for 10 o'clock, 10 p.m., 8 p.m., and they were brought up early. There was even a measure that was not even eligible, that was eligible after midnight that they brought up early. So they only have themselves to blame for not bringing up this so-called bail reform bill, or bills that they have. Seems to me that they didn't even have the votes for the constitutional amendment, or else they could have brought it up ahead of time. So that was a decision made by leadership not to bring the bill up ahead of time. So they have only themselves to blame for not taking the vote on that one.
And where are you on bail reform?
Well, the bills got they got worse, and there was no reform in these bills. These bills that were designed to detain people without giving them access to you know, for a hearing. They said that there's no hearing required. So what they're trying to do is preventative detention. They rather hold you than actually give the consideration that is necessary under the Constitution to have that individual consideration of the person as to whether they are a threat to society or will return to, for their hearing or for their trial. So, it was just a sweeping measure that was going to detain so many people. The cost would have been extraordinary for counties to bear. So I don't believe that it really was reform. When the bills went to conference, they got worse. And so we're going to be back to look at them again. We'll be back.
Let me ask you, just following up on that issue, is there enough agreement? Because from discussions I've had and from what I've read, it seems like there are two issues. One issue is what you and others have brought up, which is making sure that people who cannot afford bail, and that's not the only basis that's used for them to get out. That's the only consideration for them to get out. But then the other issue is making sure that repeat violent offenders are not just going through a revolving door either, which I guess has been an issue down in Harris County. So can you talk to me a little bit about that? I mean, is there enough agreement on the one hand to make sure that violent offenders who keep, repeating, if you will, on offenses, they stay in, and maybe take a look at the non-violent offenders, who can't afford to post bail? Is that what we're talking about here?
Well, the bill went beyond that. Right now, there's already ability for a court to deny bail for those repeat violent offenders in our Constitution. Uh, we have some provisions, they just don't use it. What they were doing here was not even looking for those repeat offenders. They were just looking for what they called violent offenders. So someone who is accused or charged with a crime that they consider to be violent under our Constitution, they could be denied bail. So they're lowering the standard as to who would be eligible, who as to who would be denied bail if the court so decided. So this is something that would still allow those who have the money to get out of jail pending trial. So I don't believe that what they're doing, what the way that they're attacking this issue is really going to get to the root of the problem that we have in Texas.
What would, do you think?
Well, I think that they need to really look at we shouldn't rely on cash bail as the only system. There's some people who just don't have access to bail. Let's look at the circumstances, the individual circumstances. Look at the alleged crime that has been committed. Look at all the things that are in the totality of the circumstances for that individual and the victim. You do need to consider the victim, but they started putting in so many factors in here that it got to be so onerous that a judge is going to have no choice but to really deny bail on that person. So I think that you just have to do individual consideration, which is what the Constitution, the United States Constitution requires, instead of putting all these other, requirements on judges.
And my last question I wanted to ask you about is what your thoughts were on the bills to prevent what we saw happen, the deadly power outages in February. Senate Bill 2, Senate Bill 3 passed, a number of other issues, securitization. What's your thought on those? Were those good? Did they go far enough? What's your thought?
Well, there's always you can do hindsight and look back and say, yeah, we should have did, more. But we did have some missed opportunities. I'm glad we took steps to strengthen our infrastructure, encourage businesses. Basically, it's just an encouragement for businesses to, weatherize and winterize their equipment. But when what happened with these bills that address the power grid in Texas is no different than what has happened in the throughout the whole session. Democrats would provide or produce amendments, and when we attempted to temper provisions that we felt were harmful to our constituents, our amendments were either stripped out, watered down, or flat out denied. And so, what has happened with the power grid amendments in SB 7, critical race theory, permitless carry. I could go on and on. Those attempts by Democrats have been pretty much, ignored. So I'm glad we did take some initial steps to address our power grid, but there's more work that can be done to strengthen it.
All right, State Representative Nicole Collier of Fort Worth. Thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate your time today.